If you're looking for proven ways to take your fundraising results to the next level, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast, hosted by Tammy Zonker. Tammy has trained and led thousands of nonprofit organizations to collectively raise more than $500 million and is also recognized as one of America's top 20 fundraising experts. This is the podcast where Tammy equips and empowers amazing fundraising pros like you to transform your fundraising so you can transform the world. And now, let's hear from Tammy.
Welcome to the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast. Our guest today is Kent Stroman. He is the founder of the Institute for Conversational Fundraising and author of several books, including Asking About Asking, The Art of Conversational Fundraising, The Intentional Board, Why Your Board Doesn't Work and How to Fix It. I think we should all read that immediately or reread it. And the Asking Academy Resource Manual. He's a certified fundraising executive whose counsel has been honed by 40 years in fundraising, board governance, strategic planning, capital campaigns, major donor solicitation, and financial management. 40 years. I have, of course, known of Kent for many, many years, as we're both conference speakers and our paths have crossed many times in that regard. But I have had the privilege of getting to really know Kent over the past 2 years as a colleague and fellow advisor at Capital Campaign Pro, co-founded by Amy Eisenstein and Andrea Kilstead. He's wise, he's funny, and at last he's here. Kent, welcome to the show.
Tammy, you had one job today, and that was to set the bar low, and I think you failed miserably on that. But thank you for the nice introduction.
Yes, I tell the truth. Kent, let's just jump right in. What is conversational fundraising, and how does it differ from some traditional fundraising models?
Wow. We think that the best fundraising is mutually enjoyable and beneficial for everybody who's involved. And I find a lot of people, and this is my story, being scared to death with the idea of fundraising because it's this intimidating, negative experience. It's a lose-lose equation. And who wants to do that, right? For me, that's what goes with transactions. And in fact, a lot of times people talk about fundraising and sales as being the same thing. I think there's certainly some overlap, but fundamentally very different because in fundraising, we get to invite people to do what they want to do. And so rather than a confrontation, we think it's all about a conversation. Rather than a transaction, it's more of a relationship.
I love that. And, you also in the book, you talk about the quality of the conversations, the genuineness of the conversations, and how key that is to building trust. Unpack that a little bit for us.
And again, I think the question, what qualifies me to write the book or to be a consultant, I think it's because I've already made all the mistakes. I've done it wrong, and I want to spare other people of that agony. So one of the things that we really focus on is the difference between what I call a head question versus a heart question. And so a head question, that's something about facts. Tammy, where did you get those glasses? So that's a fact. But a heart question, I'm curious, what was it like for you when you got your first pair of glasses? So in fundraising, we could say, do you have any money and can I have it? Those are off-putting head questions. But one of my favorite questions in fundraising is, I would love to hear, how did you become so generous? Or another form of that, how did you learn to give? And somebody asked me that question recently, and actually it took me back to my childhood at 9 years old. So the difference between a fact and a story, between the head and the heart, they all matter. We engage differently when it's a heart conversation than if we're just exchanging data.
Yes. And to your point, it tells the donor, I really care about you. I want to learn about you, not just your ability to give.
Exactly. Some of this stuff, it kind of hurts my soul because I think I've told you I'm a recovering accountant. Finance is my background and I love numbers. But one of the reasons that I love numbers is because they tell me so much about what's numbers, right? but a friend of mine shared this thought with me, which has really opened the horizon up for me. He said, numbers numb, but stories store. And so if we can engage, first of all, around something that is relational, something that does store. So we talk about the mission. Why do we even exist as an organization? Well, really, there's almost always a name and a face and a story of why we came into existence in the first place. And then some numbers follow that. Until we can define the why, then the what and the when and the who and the how many and the where, those things don't have a point of connection.
I love that quote, numbers numb, stories store. Sometimes I think that we as fundraisers, especially early in our career before we, as you said, and as I can agree, before we have learned better, while we're making all the mistakes and thinking that we have to be
Mm,
perfect. We think we have to go in and say just the right words. We have to know everything about our mission and our programs. We can't possibly have the donor ask us a question that we don't have
mm,
the answer to. So we sometimes do way too much
yeah.
talking and way too little listening or asking those deeper questions. The other alternative, even when we get a little more seasoned in our career, is that, okay, we've learned to ask questions and to listen and really get to know our supporters, but sometimes we're bringing along our CEO or our executive director, and they maybe haven't learned those lessons yet. They're in that we have to present or impress and talk all about our organization that was founded in 1947. Talk to us about both of those scenarios. The fundraiser that talks too much or feels like they have to do everything perfectly. And then once we learn, how do we guide and support and help our leadership be more effective in those donor visits? We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Hindsight builds technology that helps nonprofits make a difference. It was born when three leading-edge nonprofit technologies, iWave, Ascend, and Nonprofit OS, came together to better support organizations with purpose-built tools designed to make fundraising easier, faster, and more effective. With a combined 40 years working with nonprofits and other fundraising organizations, we have seen the generosity landscape evolve and change in ways we never could have predicted. It's become clear that the best approach to fundraising is a personalized and meaningful one, a human approach. But that's not easy when goals are high and resources are scarce. That's where Kindsight comes in. With Kindsight, fundraisers can find and qualify potential donors with the world's largest proprietary donor database, engage with those donors quickly and effectively with AI-powered content generation, and keep everything on track with a centralized CRM built specifically for fundraising teams. Connect your story to donors who care about your cause at any scale in real time. That's the power of Kindsight.
It's interesting that you're asking this question today because, one of the things, probably the one thing that if I had to always and only do one thing professionally, it would be the Asking Academy. Because in that setting, we bring together fundraising professionals, organizational executives, and then volunteers. And what we equip them to do is what you just described, Tammy, and that is to engage with donors in a way that's most meaningful to the donor. So it's primarily a listening session, not an education or a teaching session. As long as I've been doing this, I have to prepare myself every time, right? First of all, we ask the question, what do we want to walk away with? And the answer is not money. It's relationship, it's awareness. In fact, one of the things that we constantly hammer on in the Asking Academy is it's this quote: the most important part of a donor call is not what you say, it's what you hear. And so if we're going to experience the most important thing, we've got to hear the right thing. And to hear the right thing, we have to ask the right thing. And in order for that to happen, because I don't know about you, I always panic, when it's kind of showtime. So I've got to prepare to know what is kind of the ultimate question that I want to ask. And so let's make it simple. The purpose of our meeting, regardless of who we're meeting with, is would you be receptive to a major funding request? Okay, so let's say that's the big question. And if that's what we want to hear the answer to, then we know what we're asking about. The next thing is, when do we ask that? And we really set a high bar on this. And so we think the ideal time to ask the biggest question we have to ask is someplace between 25 and 30% of the way into the meeting. So if we've got a 1-hour meeting, we're 15 or 20 minutes in. And you say, are you kidding? You're going to make the big ask at 15 or 20 minutes? Yes. And why is that important? Because everything before we make the big ask is all theoretical. After the big ask, it's all practical. I mean, it gets really, really real. And if the purpose of me showing up is solely to make a presentation, I show up, I go into presentation mode, and right before the clock strikes 12 or whatever it is, I stop talking and everybody's done. That's a presentation. It's not a conversation. On the other hand, yes, there is a presentational period, but we want to spend a very few minutes during that 15 to 20 minute lead in just to give a context so that when we ask the question, it relates to something. And then when we ask that question, now they start processing something we've been thinking about in our own minds for, hours, days, maybe weeks. First time they heard it, perfect time to stop talking and now start responding or reacting, presenting, or dominating. And so, that question I mentioned earlier, how did you learn to give? There is no way I could predict how somebody's going to answer that. What stories you hear when you ask that question and how it stimulates both the relationship and how that influences the rest of our conversation. And so we've got to have time to listen. And for that to happen, we have to ask early and we have to ask strategically.
I love that. And I've witnessed it as well when you'll go in to a meeting where there is an understood that an ask is going to be made. It's understood by the fundraiser, maybe the board person who's accompanying the CEO, and the donor has a good indication because if we've done cultivation well, we've talked about an upcoming project, it really shouldn't be a surprise that we're there to ask or to invite them to join us in this endeavor. And I see it time and time again. I'm sure you have too over your 40 years in fundraising. We kind of are so nervous sometimes. We spend so much time in the rapport building phase, and then the meeting is almost over before we pop the question. And then we don't necessarily have the opportunity for that dialogue, for the donor to make a comment, to ask clarifying questions, to talk about impact or terms. We don't have the time to respond as you're indicating. And so I love this idea of 25 to 35% into the meeting. We really do want to begin transitioning into the invitation, to the ask. And I think that where my mind went was, okay, so this is so good. And that means when I sit down, I want to confirm we scheduled for an hour. Are you still available for an hour? Right? I mean, that's like, okay, so that gives me a milestone. And then I know when to transition. And we need to prep our CEO, our executive director, our board member, whomever is accompanying us, if they are, like, we're going to talk about this. We're going to ask some questions, rapport building up until, and then the intention is that I will transition us into the invitation. So I think everyone on the nonprofit side of the table, so to speak, should be aware of that and be on board with that. But I absolutely love making the ask at that pivotal timeline. This is something that you teach, you train in the Asking Academy. You work with teams. As you said, it's a cross-functional team within an organization. Can you tell us kind of a before and after story of an organization that, maybe they were in that mode Jerry Panish used to talk about, aim, 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 and never getting around to popping the question, right? Do you have a before and after success story of an organization? You can leave their names out.
Yeah, boy, there's so many. And, I wish I could take credit for them, but here, what I love doing is equipping people to do things that really, really work well and that are enjoyable for everybody in the process. And then stepping back and watching them follow through and get the results. So, and I'm going to share something that happened earlier this year. But first, one of the things I want to mention is we have a tool that we use. It's called a donor call strategy. And that's where we plan out how we envision the meeting going minute by minute. And it never goes that way. It always goes better with a plan than it does without. And by the way, part of that plan on an hour minute, and if we've got an hour meeting, we want to be prepared to be finished at 50 minutes because we want the last 10 minutes to be available, to be totally unscripted. We've done what we came to do. And then that's where you get into what we usually start with, which is called small talk. And instead of doing small talk, we like to do big talk. Big talk happens after the work is finished. I think this was in the winter of 2024 Asking Academy. We had somebody who, she and her team were there. She's a brand new executive director. She knows the organization well, but not in this role. Well, one of the questions, you heard it earlier, is the question about giving. How did you learn to give, or how did you become so generous? And she had a real reservation about that particular question. I didn't know it at the time, but she said she was telling herself, it was like she was sitting there with her arms folded. I would never do that. And that's what she was telling herself. I would never do that. That seems like such an invasive question, and it would be so uncomfortable to ask somebody that. Well, anything you've never done before is going to be uncomfortable. But I mean, she had her mindset locked down. She was totally closed to it. And then she goes, I don't know if this was her first serious donor call after the summit. But if not first, it was like first, second, or third. She goes into this meeting, and there was something about the relationship that was it had some tension in it. So add that on top, right? So she told me afterwards that there came a point in that conversation where it was obvious to her that for her to not ask that question would be negligent on her part. So she said, she asked the question, I'm just curious, how did you learn to give? And she said it was as if immediately somebody flipped a switch, and the conversation went from being almost a prosecution and defense kind of feel to a warm relationship. And he told her about his background and where philanthropy became a part of his life. Anyhow, and immediately they just came together. So again, at this point, I didn't know about any of this. Well, she and her development director wanted to meet with me. So sure. And she starts off with this apology, because now for the first time, she tells me about the resistance. And anyhow, I mean, you couldn't have scripted that any better if you tried. But that's an example of something where the whole approach, the conversation, the touch points were entirely foreign to her. Once she saw them, she didn't immediately latch on. She reluctantly held off. Then she saw, since then, she's told me there have been a couple of other donor calls she's had where it's been the same kind of thing. For us, it's all theoretical until we get face to face. Now I'm not doing something because I think I have to. This is apparent. It would be a mistake not to use this new tool that I have.
But this question isn't something we're doing to a donor. We are doing for a donor. I absolutely love that. And you said something earlier where you demonstrated like permission. So if you're someone who feels that hesitancy, like you're not comfortable, you do feel like that question is invasive or intrusive, you can ask permission, right? Like, may I ask you, would you be willing to share where you learned to be so generous? Was it a family member? Was it like, how? I love that. And you're right. Once that goes well, it becomes your new favorite question. That's for sure.
Exactly. Can I tell you my favorite response to that question?
Please.
This gentleman, well, actually, you made a reference earlier to asking about asking. This guy was a retired corporate executive, and I learned so much from him about fundraising that if the only things I knew about fundraising are what I learned from Jim, that would be enough. But so early when I had started my consultancy, I was doing a board project. I was doing one-on-one interviews with board members. He was a member of the board. And I don't think I'd ever asked that question before, Tammy. I don't know why I asked it then, but I asked Jim that question. I said, Jim, for him, he was visibly generous. So it wasn't just about giving, it was about generosity. And I said, how did you come to be so generous? And here's what he told me. He said, I was raised in a parsonage. Now you're young enough, you may not even know what that word means, Tammy, but they used to have a parson who was the pastor, and the parsonage is where the pastor lived. And he said, I was raised in a parsonage. And he said, that's where I learned to give, but that's not where I learned to be generous. Tell me more. And he said, I learned to be generous from the tragedy of watching people die rich. Yeah, let those words sink in, right? The tragedy of watching people die rich. I'd never heard those words before. I'd never thought about that. I'd never viewed that circumstance as tragic. But when Jim said that to me, he told me more about, and I knew him well, but he told me more about himself than what I ever knew up to that point. And he shared with me his values, his motivation. And I'm so glad that I asked that question. And I'll tell you that was one of my first interviews of board members. Well, that was the first time I asked the question. That's good every time after that, right? Because it was just so relevant in a particular setting. And so anyhow, like I said, I could have lived my entire life guessing, how did Jim learn to become generous? I never would have come up with that, right? That's the neat thing, again, about that particular question. People tell you so much about themselves. And like you said, if I'm not sure, if I'm feeling uneasy, I've got to ask for permission. And so my way of asking for that, and I didn't feel this with Jim, but if I did, I'd say something like this, Jim, I just had this question come to mind. I don't know if it might be out of place. Would you mind if I was to ask a little deeper question on that? And what I find is when we ask permission, we're almost never denied. So when we're invited in, then it's almost like there's no limit to the depth, right? But if we force our way in, if we're not sure and we think, well, I'll just risk it. Don't risk it. I love the way you immediately go to, let's ask for permission.
So good. Really good. All right. So we know one of your favorite go-to questions. How did you learn to become so generous? How did you learn about giving? What are some of your other favorite questions to start the meaningful conversations with supporters or probable supporters?
Well, so again, to give a context, one structure that's embedded in asking about asking is this 10-step staircase. And so the idea is that we're asking for a gift, but that's on step 10. Before we get there, we have 9 other steps that are all asking for, but they're not asking for a gift, right? And so the one we shared, I'll tell you another one I love is we call it this step asking about purpose. And so there is a common question in fundraising that we usually ask this question in different words than what I'm going to share, but you'll immediately recognize it. What we ask is, what do you want your gift to pay for? Okay. And so again, we don't say it that way, but what we lead with, salaries and utilities and bricks and shingles and glass and wood, right? So we talk about building, we talk about, staffing and our operating budget. Those are not engaging words, but we talk about that. And then we ask them in some form or another, what do you want to pay for? Well, what we put in place of that is when it comes to the appropriate, we've talked about how you may be involved philanthropically, but what would you like your gift to accomplish? And that's another one of those heart questions versus head questions. And so let's say I'm talking to a very generous, engaging philanthropist. We'll call her Tammy. And I ask this question, what would you like your gift to accomplish? And let's say that we're at the food bank. Tammy's going to say, wow, I really hadn't thought about it that way before, but I love what you guys do. Here's what would be most meaningful to me. In my kind of quadrant of the city, every night when I went to bed, if I could be confident that there's no child in my neighborhood that's going hungry, that would mean so much to me. Now, again, that's a relationship and a heart conversation. Now, are we going to go downtown and buy groceries? Yeah. But You don't care about the groceries. It's hunger gnawing at a child's. That's what you care about. So the groceries become a tool, just like the building is a tool and the salaries and all that stuff is a tool. So I love to ask that question. What would you like to see your gift accomplish? And then stop talking and listen to what the donor has to say.
Oh, I love that. I mean, it's all about the impact and what speaks to their heart most closely. Yeah. And twice you've said, stop talking and listen, right? So
That's the hard
important.
part.
And it is the hard part. And then when I use that phrase in my trainings or wherever I'm speaking, there's almost always someone in the audience or one of the participants who says that old sales adage, yeah, stop talking because the first person who speaks loses. And you referred to something that
Yep.
hurts your soul earlier. That comment hurts my
Yeah.
soul, right? Because in our world, there should be no
Right.
losers.
Right. The reason we showed up is to elevate the win. Right.
Yes. And your question about what do you want your gift, your potential gift to accomplish? That really gets to the essence of how satisfying the giving of that gift will be when that donor or that family is assured or feels confident that no one in their community or the community they have a heart for, that none of those children will go to bed hungry.
Yeah.
And again, if it's a $100,000 problem, I'm just pick that number out of the air. I'm sure it's far too small to assure no hunger. And you're asking me for 10,000. I mean, we can frame it in, your gift, your support and others, right? So that it doesn't feel like, oh, I couldn't possibly make what I really want to happen. And I think that that's also one way to open up a conversation about, well, who else do you know that shares that same passion, right? Again, the follow on questions are as juicy as the questions because it's, to your point, a dialogue. It's a meaningful conversation.
For sure.
Yeah. One of the things that I think people sometimes as fundraisers get stuck on is that we'll ask a great question and the donor will give a really good answer. And sometimes we don't know what they meant.
Mm.
What did they mean by that? Like, I could take that a couple different ways. But let's talk about the follow on. Like earlier in your example, you said, say more about that. Tell me more about that, which is one of those ways that we can have the donor to elaborate to help us really understand. What do you teach? What do you believe about helpful follow on, deeper dive questions when we're maybe not really sure what the
Yeah.
donor meant, or we could interpret it a couple
Yeah.
different ways?
Boy, interpretation, isn't that a challenge? And so the way you frame this whole question actually underscores one of the things that we insist on as much as we can. It's like, I don't have any authority here. Here's something I want to insist on. And that is we've got to have a call team, not solo. And somebody will say, well, I don't need so-and-so. Well, everybody in the room is part of the audience. And one of the reasons it's become so crucial to me is it took me a long time to figure this out, Tammy, but I realized that when I'm in that lead role at that moment, half of my brain stops working. And something that I would have an instant recall any other time, I got nothing. And so that's part of what's at play, right? And why it's so valuable to work in tandem. And so there are lots of questions and actually lots of versions of this question I'm going to share with you. But this has become my favorite because when we hear something, we think we heard it perfectly, but we're not real sure. Probably the most common thing is to not follow up. So we're back to guessing and assuming about, we heard it accurately, but what does it mean? So here's my really simple follow-up. So you would say something, I would just say, that's really fascinating. How do you mean that? So that's the question. How do you mean that? And the common question is, what do you mean? And that for some reason, that lands more confrontational than how do you mean that? I've heard something similar to that before. I don't want to miss. Could you just, how do you mean?
I love that. And it does take some confidence, but it also shows the donor, like, I really want to understand you. Because if we don't ask that follow on question and then we operate in a different way, they could easily think, well, I shared what I thought, but they obviously didn't care or they didn't agree. Maybe we're not in alignment. And it doesn't strengthen the relationship. It can actually erode trust. Yeah, such a good point. So what are some other ways that we as fundraisers that we can ensure that donors feel heard, seen, and valued in these conversations?
You covered a lot of territory with one question there.
Well, I just want to learn. Like I'm a sponge when I'm around you, Kent.
Well, that's beautiful.
Thank
So
you.
heard, seen, and understood. Well,
Yeah, valued.
um,
Yeah, valued, understood.
actually, I think mindset eclipses everything else. And so when you have that mindset, again, am I going to tell or am I going to hear? Just with that one distinction, that entirely changes. Am I there to present or am I there to perceive? So it goes back to that plan, that preparation, that setting of the mind, the having, I want to have a plan, but it's not a script. Usually there's one question that I want to be scripted, and that's how we ask whatever we think our biggest ask is going to be. And which for a lot of people, the thing that we feel most anxious about is, how much should I ask for? Has that question ever occurred to you or anybody you work with, Tammy, like every day? And so, that's another one of the steps on our staircase. It's asking about amounts. And how many people are there in the world? Like 8 billion or something, a whole bunch, right? Well, there's one person in the world who can answer that question. And if there's 3 people in the room, there's still only one person who can answer it. But we feel this compulsion to answer it for them, which I think is a big mistake. And so instead of that, I think it's step number 6, asking about amount with a context. And the context is a gift chart. It says we're looking for these size and these many of these gifts. That's a question I love to ask at the appropriate time. That's the question. At the appropriate time, what range of gifts should we even be talking about? And I like to ask for a range, not a number. And if you want to hear, I'll tell you why. But when we introduce that question and proceed it with at the appropriate time, it instantly signals I'm not asking for a gift. I'm not asking for a decision. I'm asking for contemplation, for guidance. What range of gifts should we be talking? Well, for me to walk in and to have decided you should give at this level, and we almost never say that. I will tell you, I've heard fundraisers ask or say that we've decided you, and whatever follows, you may as well just leave, because it's not
Yeah.
our place to decide for other people. And anyhow, that's another one of those mindset things. And even if we never voice that word, but if that's in our mindset, that tone comes through the entire conversation. Here's a permission question that I want to ask even before this. So, Timmy, I'm wondering, could I have your permission at the appropriate time to just put together a really simple gift request? And the reason I ask for that is, obviously, I'm pretty excited about this project. And from what you've shared, I can see that there's also an interest there. But when it is time to request a gift, I want to be really clear what it is we're asking for. And so you can be really clear about what you're agreeing to. Is one of those things where we actually get on the same page. And so if I've asked for that permission earlier and it's almost always granted, sometimes, well, you don't have to do that for me. I know I need to do it for me. Helps me keep stuff sorted out in my mind. So then when we come back and now we're talking about amounts, and I'm not sure demanding, there's these top 3 gifts and you've got to make one of them. How in the world would I know that without being extremely presumptuous? And we're taught how to be presumptuous. We're not taught how to be inquisitive well. And so when we can ask at the appropriate time, what range of gifts should we be talking? Again, that takes something that is very academic. It's a gift chart, and now it's really personal. Okay, now it's where am I on this? So can I tell you where that became most impactful to me?
Yes.
I was doing a feasibility study, and I was in this lady's, she was an older lady. I was in her home, in her living room, and I had never asked that question before, Tammy. It was at that part of the conversation where I needed to ask for what we call gift indication. So I just asked her that. She's looking at the gift chart. And so I asked her the question, and she looked at the two lowest numbers on the leadership gift range. And she said, well, we would probably give someplace between 250,000 and half a million. And I just immediately, authentically, I said, wow, where I come from, the difference between those two numbers is a lot of money. I said, when it comes time, how will you decide? I'd never asked that before. I don't know that I've ever heard it before, but it's another one of those I never not asked that now, because here's what she told me. She said, this was an arts project, and she was on the board of the organization. She said, we love the art, and we're so excited about this project. We're going to want to support it. But she says, we're also very involved in our local church. And we're in the process of relocating our church campus, and we're going to want to give to that as well. So she said, it probably just depends who asks us first. What do you do with that? So anyhow, when she told me how she was going to decide, you can't read that in a book. You can't get it on wealth screening. You're not going to see it on a personal profile. And the good news is, can I tell you the good news? The reality?
Please do. Yes.
So when it was eventually time for her to give, she didn't give a $500,000. She didn't give 250,000. She gave $1 million. Now, you know why she gave $1 million? Because she wanted to, right? She wanted to. And here's the other thing I know, that other project she was talking, the church, it was so important to her, their timeline just didn't intersect. In fact, this was years ago, and they still haven't relocated. But in the process of somebody asking about what she would want to do, she would decide between two alternatives, and being focused on her, eventually she decided for her, for them, for then, it was $1 million solution. And I'm so glad I didn't show up telling her that she should give $500,000. Because I think that's an easy way to suppress it, regardless of what number you're leading with. We have absolutely no context for their capacity. The only context we have is the problem, the solution that's wrapped up in the campaign or whatever. And then we have this structure, gift chart. Now we ask them in one way or another, where do you see yourself in this equation? Once they've told us they do see themselves in the equation.
And to your point, and as you demonstrated, that follow-on question. All right, well, where I come from, that's a big difference. How will you decide? So insightful. Yeah. And we could probably have a whole nother episode on, the asking for a range or asking for a specific dollar amount. I mean, it's just like the part that's like the art of fundraising, right? There's the best practices, the emerging practices, and then there's the art, which is informed by experience. Yeah. So good, Kent. Really good. And then just illuminating that other point is that those kinds of conversations, those qualifying conversations that are really about genuine interest, curiosity, wanting this opportunity, this invitation to give to be so special for this supporter, that mindset is so important. And it is important not just at the actual ask, it's important from beginning to infinity, right? Those cultivation visits are so key to understanding how to make that ask so special and to bridge the need, the goal, and what gives the donor the most joy.
Absolutely. Isn't that the fun part of what we do, Tammy?
We're so fortunate. I mean, it's a lot of work, but we would be doing a lot of work in whatever career we chose. And yet we chose this work, and it's so beautiful, so satisfying. I just want to wrap up this conversation with asking, what other parting wisdom, insights, or encouragement would you like to share with our audience?
Wow. You ask really good questions, by the way. Thanks for making this available.
Thank you.
I think it would be this, and that is to be thoughtful. What am I trying to accomplish? And by the way, I'll share this. We in the Asking Academy, we have a different definition of success in fundraising. So, from your long career in this field, the typical definition of success in fundraising is to get the gift. If you get the gift, it's a win. If you don't get the gift, it's a loss. Well, there's some things I find problematic about that. And so here's our definition of success. And that is our job is to help donors make well-informed decisions. I want to help donors make well-informed decisions. And I realize we would call this a risk. I realize one of the risks is they may decide that giving to our organization at this time is not the best thing for them to do. And I want to be equipped, and I want those that I coach to be equipped with the freedom to receive that, rather than to feel like our job is to force them to do a thing they don't want to do or that just ain't right for them right now. And so, because I know that however it goes, they're going to have a conversation with somebody after our conversation is over. And let's say they say, you know what, when we're talking about hungry kids, I don't like kids, I don't like food, I don't like people, I just, I give to save the planet. Okay. Can I introduce you to my friends at the Nature Conservancy? They do that work in such an exceptional way. And well, I'm not saying that I don't want to give, I want you to give when and where and how it's most meaningful to you. So let's say that's the scenario. When they're at the country club that night, having dinner with their friends, what's the conversation going to be like? Man, I can't believe it. Somebody from Feed the Children showed up and they asked me not to give to them when they realized that really isn't what suits me.
My heart is elsewhere.
Right. So somebody at the table says, well, my heart's not elsewhere. I like children. I like food. I like kids being happy. Who was that again?
Yes.
You connect with them.
And if we operated like that more often, wouldn't we get more referrals, more introductions? When we dwell in this transactional fundraising world where the number one goal is get the money, people know that, they sense it. And that's why they're so closed with their referrals and their circle of influence. And now for a final word from our sponsor.
Every fundraiser knows that the secret to success lies in creating authentic connections. This starts with data, but that data needs to turn into insights that inspire action, which in turn fosters generosity and long-term donor relationships. Kindsight's fundraising intelligence solution lets any nonprofit do just that at any scale, with the world's largest proprietary donor database, AI-powered content generation, an award-winning CRM built specifically for fundraising teams, and much more. Go to kindsight.io to see it in action.
Yeah, I've got a quote from a professional friend of mine. You probably know the name Kevin Fitzpatrick. He says, people aren't afraid to be asked for a gift. They're afraid to be deceived. Mm. And, you and I both talked about authenticity, genuine, transparent. If we can have a conversation, I want to be able to converse with people in a fundraising context like I converse with you, or like I converse tonight at dinner with my son and my grandkids. Authenticity. And I hope that I'm going to have a chance to see that same person again in a different setting, a different context. And it will be one where we're immediately drawn, rather than, I hope that they don't see me. I hope we don't see each other. So anyhow, again, that's back to the set of the mind. And what was it Gail Perry says, we're not human doings, we're human beings. And so how we want to be consistent in every facet of life, not fake in one and real in another.
Amazing. Such wisdom as we kind of wrap up this episode. Thank you, Kent.
Oh, thanks for allowing me to be part of it.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're not done quite yet. Hang on. At the end of each episode, I like to ask a few rapid fire questions to provide even more value to our listeners. Are you ready?
I don't know. We'll find out.
You'll find out. Number 1, what's the best fundraising advice you've ever received?
Listen to the donor.
Perfect. What book do you recommend to our audience and why?
My new favorite is The Coaching Habit. I just picked that within the last month, and I wish I picked it up 30 years before it was written. But why? It includes 7 essential questions. And those questions are a lot of what we've done is discovering what's on somebody else's mind and how we can make that meaningful and serve them rather than how they can serve us.
Yeah. There's a quote I heard from one of my clients, and she couldn't recall where she heard it, so I can't attribute it. Or if you do share it and attribute it, you could attribute it to me because I think it's really amazing. Kidding. The quote is, "It's time that we start wanting as much for our donors as we
Hmm,
want from our donors." Mm,
absolutely. I love that. Well, when you find that source, let me know because I want to quote her.
all right, will do.
Until then, it's Tammy.
What are the three most important traits a successful fundraising professional must possess?
Hmm. Well, I think we've touched on them. Authenticity, curiosity, and then a unwavering dedication to listening over speaking.
Love it. What's your favorite fundraising tool or application?
Mm-mm. This one probably won't surprise you. My favorite fundraising tool is a gift chart. And I remember one time I was speaking at the AFP International Conference on Fundraising. There were about 260 people in the room. This was 10 years ago. And I asked the question, I said, by show of hands, who would say that presently you regularly use a gift chart in your gift solicitation? There might have been 24 hands that went up.
Wow.
I was really surprised. And I'm seeing more and more acceptance of the use of that powerful, powerful tool. And here's one of the things I've discovered. Talking about money with somebody is a hard conversation. And when we're talking to their face, it's even harder. But when we have a chance to both sit and look at a piece of paper and talk to the paper, it gets infinitely easier. So
Hmm.
that's a tool.
Yeah, I love that tool as well. What's your favorite conference or ongoing learning opportunity?
Wow. There's so many good choices. You know, I'm going to say it's the Global Leadership Conference. And one of the things that I love about that is I know I'm going to hear top-notch speakers, and it isn't a fundraising conference. It is like a fundraiser conference. And so I'm going to hear things that apply in a space that isn't designed to be applicable. And anyhow, it's always fun. I think one of the things I have a lot of fun with is finding what I'm not looking for. And that's a good place for that to happen.
Yeah, awesome. I agree that we can learn from others outside of the sector as well. So we'll definitely include a link to the Global Leadership Conference in the show notes so people can learn more about that. All right, last question. You've been doing great. Knowing what you know now about fundraising, what advice would you give your younger self just getting started in the profession?
It is the power of the advice visit. When I seek advice, I'm looking up and I'm asking somebody for one of their most precious possessions. It's not their people, not their money, not their time. Those are all really, really precious. But when I ask for their advice, I'm asking for something that's unique. And when I do it sincerely, I have never had anybody turn me down.
Mm, love it. Kent, it has been amazing talking with you today. Thank you again.
You are so welcome. Can't wait till we're together again next time.
Yeah, very good. If you want to learn more about Kent Stroman, conversational fundraising, or any of the other resources that we've talked about today, check out the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast, and keep on transforming your fundraising so you can transform the world. The Intentional Fundraiser Podcast is a Fundraising Transformed original. It's hosted by me, Tammy Zonker, founder and president of Fundraising Transformed, where we help equip and empower fundraisers, nonprofit leaders, and board members to transform their fundraising so they can transform the world. Visit fundraisingtransform.com/podcast to subscribe to this podcast and subscribe to my newsletter to get fundraising lessons, tools, and helpful resources delivered straight to your inbox each month. If you want my help with taking your fundraising to the next level, become a member of my Fundraising Transformers community as a growth member and join me live each month where I'll teach you the same strategies I use to lead, train, and coach thousands of nonprofits, social service organizations, healthcare foundations, private schools, colleges, and universities to collectively raise more than $500 billion, including a single gift of $27.1 million. As a member, you can participate in my Ask Me Anything sessions every month and get answers to your burning questions. Chat with other growth members inside our private and safe online community about what you're working on, struggling with, and share lessons learned. And get instant access to my growing library of on-demand self-paced training classes. New content is added every single month. Learn more about becoming a member at fundraisingtransform.com/growth. Talk soon.